More than 50 years ago, the Pontifical Biblical Commission instructed readers of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, to pay careful attention to the three stages of the tradition in which Jesus' teachings have been handed on. Stage 1, Jesus himself. Stage 2, the apostles preaching about Jesus in light of his resurrection. Stage 3, the evangelists who composed their gospels more than 40 years after Jesus died. That extremely few Catholics today even have a clue about this is a disgraceful outrage. In 1993, the same commission published a document entitled The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church, in which it praised the insights from cultural anthropology that can shed so much fresh light on the Bible and make the characters and storylines of the Bible culturally plausible. Again, Catholics, by and large, are completely ignorant to this. These Bible Alive reflections attempt to describe the most plausible Mediterranean historical and cultural scenario for the Gospels at any of the three levels. The scenario for this Sunday's Gospel selection helps a reader to see at least two of them rather clearly. Luke chapter 12, verses 32 through 48. Jesus said, "Do not be afraid any longer, little flock, for your Father is pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your belongings and give alms. Provide money bags for yourselves that do not wear out, an inexhaustible treasure in sky vault that no thief can reach nor moth destroy. For where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. Gird your loins and light your lamps, and be like servants who await their master's return from a wedding, ready to open immediately when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds vigilant on his arrival. Amen, I say to you, he will gird himself, have them recline at table, and proceed to wait on them. And should he come in the second or third watch and find them prepared in this way, blessed are those servants. Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house get broken into. You also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" And the Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly, I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his property. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' and begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants, to eat and drink and get drunk, then that servant's master will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour and will punish him severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. That servant who knew his master's will but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will shall be beaten severely. And the servant who was ignorant of his master's will but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating shall be beaten only lightly. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more." Hearers and readers of this Sunday's Gospel need an appropriate time scenario to read these verses. While Americans are normally future-oriented, peasants who scratch out bare subsistence are too deeply mired in present concerns such as daily bread to think about the future at all. Mediterranean culture is primarily focused on the present, albeit a wide present including the last 24 hours and the next 24 hours, the exact yesterday and the exact tomorrow. And yet, reading most verses of this Sunday's Gospel, we see that they clearly do have a future thrust. With each generation of believers, the original statement of Jesus, Gospel Development Stage 1, recedes more and more into the past and makes the future seem increasingly distant from the gospel point of view. The question, therefore, is, does this future thrust derive from the historical Jesus, gospel development stage 1, or from the evangelist we name Luke, gospel development stage 3? Or does it come from both? And just how far into the future does each one see? In the Gospels, Jesus often shows himself to be counter-structural in his culture. When the culture holds one value orientation, Jesus tends to propose an alternative. Peasants were intensely oriented to the present moment. Elites, for example the Sadducees, and scholars of the tradition, the scribes, were primarily oriented to the past. Hardly anyone in this culture was oriented toward the future. The future thrust of these verses in Luke's Gospel, which call for watchfulness and fidelity, contrasts strongly with the typical peasant's spontaneous response to the present moment. When the cat's away, the mice will play. When the master is gone, the servant who feels so inspired will beat other slaves, eat and drink and get drunk. In his typical counterstructural stance, the Lucan Jesus urges at least a little concern for the future, a rather proximate future, the forthcoming. In his parables, he speaks of the unpredictable but sure return of the Master. He also says, "The Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." More about this Son of Man figure later. Writing his gospel approximately 50 to 55 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the anonymous author we call Luke, like his readers, is all too familiar with a common lament. The risen Jesus was expected to return again, but his return had refused to materialize now some 50 years. Some people are dying, others are frustrated, and still others begin to throw care to the winds. The author we call Luke, therefore, calls for continued vigilance and fidelity. Have your belt cinched tight, freeing the feet for swift movement, and your lamps lit, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. This phrase, Son of Man, appears chiefly on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels, and can be used as a self-identification. In some instances, it can often be translated as I, as if Jesus is identifying himself as the Son of Man. But sometimes in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus uses the expression Son of Man to refer to an entity other than himself. In the fourth Gospel called John, the Son of Man is a sky being, a sky servant of God, up in the sky vault, hence a sky vault man. Similarly, in the Synoptic tradition of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, when Jesus refers to the Son of Man as an entity other than himself, this Son of Man is a sky being who will descend from the sky vault with great power and glory. Therefore, in a number of passages in the Synoptics, as generally in John, the Son of Man is a sky being. However, in the Gospel of Luke, in the majority of instances where Son of Man refers to Jesus' own self-identification, its occurrence can refer to Jesus' ministry or his suffering. But from this point in Luke chapter 12 forward, references to the Son of Man definitely describe a future judge. Many scholars believe these judge references were created and placed on the lips of Jesus by the early believers as they grew impatient waiting for his imminent return while struggling with the cruel injustices of everyday life. Notice the cruelty of the unfaithful servant and the violent punishment meted out to such in verses 45 through 48, a very plausible Mediterranean cultural scenario for readers of the Lucan Jesus. At some time, the faithful and vigilant believers reasoned, they, the wicked, will get theirs. Present-oriented peasants could find consolation in this kind of thinking, and for them, a rewarding future was more appealing than the frustrating present. Americans are quite definitely and primarily future-oriented people, and frequently neglect the present. American believers could benefit by imitating the present orientation of their peasant ancestors in the faith. This is the kind of balance that Jesus sought in his own culture.